We're going to start continuing on socioeconomic interventions. And some of these I'm going to go through very, very quickly because none of you are going to be buying American steel for public works projects, right? Right. All of you are going to be very much engaged with minority business enterprises. And I'm going to say almost nothing about it because I'm going to develop a 3-day class on minority business enterprise, which I haven't done yet. But I try not to have too much overlap, plus I haven't written it yet. So you're just supposed to focus on minority business enterprises. Do you establish a goal, a subcontracting goal, the percentage of subcontracting goal, etc.? In your solicitation, you have to identify whether there is a goal, whether there's a goal plus sub-goals for women-owned or African-American-owned businesses, what the percentage of the goal is, the overall goal, the sub-goals, etc. And you have to decide how you're going to distribute the solicitation. And to me, when you set an MBE goal, you always have both direct solicitation to MBEs and you have an MBE subcontracting goal, both of them. So that's probably about all I say about MBE on this class. Except I say, well, that same thing. Decide whether to set a goal. I say what I already said. Most agency effort relative to MBE issues will come in the procure and perform stages once you establish a goal. But that is a key issue that you have to undertake in planning. Is there a goal? What percentage? Is it on certain aspects or the whole value? A lot of permutations of setting the goal, but then most of the implementation comes in perform. Like when they submit the MBE forms, are the forms acceptable? Do you have to reject them, etc.? And then the most involvement is when you're in contract performance, getting the monthly reports, making sure the vendor does at least a good faith effort to meet the goal or whatever they have committed to. Okay, now that's all I say. Oh, we do touch on reciprocal preference. How about that? Planning stage effort only requires using the correct clause. Okay, how about, see, Gary knew that and I didn't. So, we already talked about that. Recycled paper. How many of you buy recycled paper? All right. Well, when you buy it, 90% of it is supposed to be recycled. 90% of paper that the state buys. So, that's that.
No, it's not quite that.
It's not quite that. I was just about to say, it's not quite that.
Now I'm going to get in a little bit of trouble for what I'm going to say right now because there's a new green committee that I'm on. The 90% goal is a statewide goal. Virtually everybody in the state buys recycled paper. The price differential between recycled paper and non-recycled paper sometimes is significant, where the non-recycled is lower. I have not had any personal qualm about spending less money for non-recycled paper. Now, what's going to happen when another agency gets the idea that they should go and buy non-recycled paper to save money? Well, the state's 90-plus usage is going to obviously go down. So the only thing I would say to you is what I'm doing, and that is I'm looking carefully at the differential between the costs. Where it isn't big, I'm buying recycled paper. But occasionally, because the market fluctuates so much, you could see a $2 or $3 per case difference. And then my budget sense takes over. So, I said what I said. I know it's potentially against. It could lead to a violation of this 90% rule. So be careful. And I may have to eat my words at a future date.
Okay. The only thing I don't know, since I don't buy commodities, are you actually doing a standalone purchase, or are you simply ordering off a DGS blanket contract?
We're calling Staples and Rudolph's and asking them for pricing.
Do you have the contract?
They have the state contract for office supplies.
And you
office
can
paper.
buy either type under the state contract? Okay. All right.
Well, let's put it this way. They'll sell us either type under the state contract.
And
I'm not sure.
I don't know whether they're supposed to, not supposed to. I don't get involved in this, so I just threw it up there because it's something for you to take into consideration if you're doing your own procurement of paper. Okay, anything you want to say on low noise? Okay, not much I'm going to say on low noise either. All agencies must, to the extent practicable, acquire the quietest available supplies. Planning stage effort usually involves only the use of a generic clause. Occasionally, low noise emission products could be part of a specification or objective evaluation factor. So you have to decide. What I've done is gone through the section of COMAR that has these socioeconomic preferences, and I'm just listing each of them and putting them out there. For most people, some of these only apply to a very small segment of the state agencies. Some of them apply to everybody. But I'm letting you know, you're supposed to try to get low noise, which I'm all for. For instance, I'd like that fan to be quieter. Recycled products, again, I don't buy commodities, but recycled to the extent practicable. Each agency shall require that its supplies that appear in the acceptable recycled products list contain recycled materials. And I guess DGS prepares an acceptable recycled products list, is that correct? Okay. The list will be distributed to agencies and published twice annually on eMaryland Marketplace. Planning stage involvement requires specifying recycled products when appropriate. So do it when appropriate and don't do it when not appropriate. Remember, you heard that from me. Can also give a price preference of up to 5% for the purchase of recycled products versus new products. So that's something you definitely must take into consideration. If you are specifying recycled or not specifying, but you can give a price preference. So if you're giving a price preference, you have to say it. You have to say what percentage. Planning considerations. Mercury and mercury-containing products. And this actually has, 4 or 5 slides on this. I'm not going to go through all of them, but the same general theme applies. You are supposed to try to get products that either have no mercury or the lowest possible amount of mercury. And in your specifications, if you're getting something that might include mercury in what you're trying to obtain, you can go ahead and put in the clauses relative to mercury. You can either prohibit it altogether. No vendor can bid on a product that contains mercury because we will not allow mercury. So if that's the way you want to go, you say that. And if it's not practicable to ban it altogether, there's certain things that are going to have at least a minute part of it. You can have as an evaluation the amount of mercury so that you favor a vendor or a product that has lower amounts of mercury included. Because mercury is a very bad thing. I mean, it's very toxic, very harmful.
On a soapbox.
On a soapbox.
Yet in 2012, they're going to do away with incandescent bulbs, and we can only use mercury-laden bulbs. Those fluorescent things. Federal mandate.
Okay. Maybe they'll get mercury out of them before that time. I don't know. But I guess that's why they call it mercury vapor lamps, something like that. All right, so you can read the slides on mercury and what you can do. And again, you can give a 5% price preference. Notice shall be included in the solicitations if mercury is known to be a likely component of the products being procured. So if it is, you're supposed to say something about mercury. And you can determine that the preference is not in the best interest of the state, et cetera, et cetera. In all written and electronic procurements where mercury is a component of the products being offered, bidders and offerers shall certify the mercury content of offered products to be eligible for the preference. And there is a mercury affidavit.
Please don't include the mercury affidavit if it doesn't apply. You know, if you're out there getting some service or some commodity.
Drug treatment services.
I mean, if it doesn't apply, don't put it in there. It makes us look like we're, just following a formula.
Okay. Planning stage requirements concerning mercury. Is mercury a likely component of what is being procured? Should the procurement be limited to just mercury-free products? If not, what price preference should be given to products with lower levels of mercury? Inclusion of the appropriate clauses and the mercury affidavit, if it applies. No problem with mercury? Okay, we're moving on. Locally grown foods. Now this may have an impact, particularly if you're at a facility. And if you buy food to serve to the residents, this is something that may apply to you. Locally grown food means food grown in Maryland. So no matter where you are, if you're in Baltimore and it's grown in Garrett County, that's 180 miles away, it's still a locally grown food. But a food that's grown 50 miles away in York County is not a locally grown food. So, solicitations for state schools and facilities. And again, if you're Potomac Center and Western Maryland Center, I think those are the only two facilities I heard, you are a facility. So if you're doing a solicitation, that you can limit the purchase of food to only locally grown food. If you're buying corn or vegetables or tomatoes, whatever you're buying, you can say locally grown only. That means only Maryland grown food can respond. Or if you don't say it has to be locally grown, you can give, again, up to a 5% price preference for locally versus non-locally grown food. So then you must say if it's either exclusively for locally grown or if you're going to give a price preference, and then what is the amount of preference percentage? Yes?
If you hire a vendor that's going to do the cooking and purchasing, do you have to require that they purchase locally grown food?
I guess I'm going to say no, because that is not your procurement. Maybe you can put it in the specifications, and I'll be frank, I haven't thought about that before. Because I haven't done a solicitation for food service down at DBM, so I don't know.
I would not think that you can compel them to buy locally. I mean, I guess you could put it in your solicitation, but...
Well, DGS, when they do janitorial contracts, writes into those contracts that the vendor has to buy janitorial supplies from Blind Industries. So I'm thinking that maybe you can, but I've never thought about it, and I don't know whether you should. It's a question I haven't thought about. So maybe I'll try and ask the question to somebody whether you even can.
I was going to say, Spring Grove has a cafeteria there, and I was just thinking, I'm wondering if they were part of our contract with them to buy locally. That'd be interesting.
And maybe they don't even know about this. This has only been in existence for about 2 years. So I don't know how many people even know we have this requirement. I think probably the schools were the ones it was aimed at primarily. And maybe facilities such as prisons. I'm not sure. But you have facilities that serve meals. So it's something to consider. A locally grown food price preference cannot be in addition to any other price preference. So you can't give a small preference and then a small preference of up to 5% or 8% if it's a disabled veteran-owned small business, and then also give 5% for locally grown. In that instance, it's like one or the other. So, all right.
Grown in Maryland and shipped to Delaware and packed, washed, I'm thinking lettuce and stuff, washed and packed, comes back to Maryland, and it's still Maryland grown food.
I guess so.
And if it's canned,
I guess the question is, though, can you trace it to the fact it was local? For instance, if it's a Delaware cannery, are they canning from Maryland farms, from Delaware farms, etc., so that you don't know which you're getting?
we'll get an affidavit.
Affidavit. When in doubt, get an affidavit. If you don't have one, invent your own. I didn't say that. Planning stage decisions. Is the procuring agency a state, school, or facility, i.e. can the preference even be used? Should the procurement only permit locally grown foods to be provided? If the procurement is not restricted to locally grown foods, should a price preference be established? What would be the price preference? Up to 5%. So, locally grown food. All right, now I'm going to ask a survey. This is an exercise. Drug and alcohol-free workplace. Who are for it versus against it? That's a joke. You are supposed to have in your solicitations a prohibition, well, a requirement that the vendor operate a drug and alcohol-free workplace. And in fact, the way you do this is you have a bid proposal affidavit, which is a required component of anything other than a small procurement. And one of the certifications in that bid proposal affidavit is that the vendor does operate a drug and alcohol-free workplace. And I have never seen a vendor yet, and I've been doing this for around 31 years, and I think that has been in place for 20-some years. I have never seen a vendor yet that has not agreed that they operate a drug and alcohol-free workplace. Every now and then I've had a vendor ask me, well, what would happen if I don't do everything that this affidavit says I'm supposed to do or something? You know, who's going to check? And my answer is, beats me, because I won't, and I don't know if anyone ever has. And I've only had a couple vendors over the years even ask. They typically just sign it. Yep, I operate a drug and alcohol-free workplace. Okay, move on. So, okay, gee, it's interesting that this is in there. When practicable, DGS will establish vending facilities on property controlled by DGS. The Maryland Vending Program for the Blind has the right of first refusal to operate such vending facilities. Okay. What was that? Okay. Well, this is, what I will tell you is that in April, Department of General Services has revoked the preference for blind industries to operate vending machines on facilities of this nature. So Canteen is a subcontractor to blind industries, and that's why the preference was revoked, because blind industries was not providing the service directly. They were providing it through 3 subcontractors, and they employ 1 blind person out of the whole program, which doesn't meet the preference requirements, so they no longer have the preference. And DOORS, the Department of Rehabilitation Services, which operates the Maryland Vending Program, has done a procurement to obtain vendors to operate the blind vending program in state-controlled facilities, DGS-controlled facilities, but it was protested, so there still has been no award from that. All I'm going to tell you is, in the future, it is not going to be blind industries. And what that means, if any of you have vending services that, if they currently are provided by blind industries, either directly or indirectly, once the preference is revoked and once that existing contract is no more, you have to go out and get your own. And the way you get your own is through a procurement. So there'll probably be more on that particular issue because it's still playing out. And when I wrote this, that wasn't an issue. Okay? Prevailing wage. Every public work, and a public work is public construction contract above a certain value, and that value is $500,000. The Commissioner of Labor and Industry sets a prevailing wage rate for each classification of worker that must be included in the solicitation and the contract. In the planning stage, you must determine whether what you are procuring is a public work, and typically that means construction. Something on the roads, or building a building, or building a sewage treatment plant, or something of that nature. If you have a public work and you think in any way it might be over $500,000, you put in a clause requiring it to pay the prevailing wage. And you put in the appropriate clause. That's what you do. living wage. Now, living wage is vastly different than the prevailing wage, not necessarily in the amount of money, but in the applicability. Whereas the prevailing wage only applies to public works, i.e. construction type of contracts. Living wage applies to services contracts. And there are a whole lot more services contracts, particularly for the people in this room, than there are construction contracts, because none of you probably do construction contracts, since only general services, public safety, transportation, and the university system can even do construction contracts. And none of you are them. So that means you can't. So you don't deal with prevailing wage, but you all probably do services, which means you're involved with the living wage. All right. And services strictly within the context of the living wage includes maintenance under DGS purview, because maintenance includes housekeeping services, guard services, etc. And actually, they were the primary target of this bill, one of the primary targets. And they had a little consternation when the first interpretation was that services didn't apply to the very contracts that the bill was supposedly targeting for an impact. And so, lo and behold, there was a enlarged interpretation of what services meant under the scope of this bill. So, services.
Just to clarify, I heard that right, that I only need a living wage section in a contract for maintenance services?
No. Services, but services also includes maintenance. Because if you read the definition for services, it specifically says it excludes anything within the definition of maintenance services. So most people think that when you read the definition of services in Title 21, and it has a specific exclusion, which I might even have on one of these slides, that it does not include maintenance services, that it doesn't apply to maintenance. So that's why we have to go out of our way to say, for the purposes of the living wage, services does include maintenance services. You're not referring to the definition, you're referring to what we tell you it is. And there's a little bit of a joke in that. Very little. All right. Living wage purpose.
Don't get nervous about that, because in most maintenance solicitations for facility maintenance, it's not going to apply. You'll see.
Because it only applies above 100,000. If you only have delegation to 50,000, you're not going to worry about it, because you're not going to have the ability to even use it. Anything above that is up to DGS. Okay, services means, okay, it's right here. Services means the rendering of time, effort, or work rather than the furnishing of a specific physical product other than reports incidental to the required performance. And continuing the part in white there, but does not include construction work or the purchase of goods, is excluded from the definition of service. If you go to 2101, maintenance is defined in 21010201B53. So that's how maintenance is defined in Title 21, and for living wage, it's included. Okay, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time on living wage because it's something that, since it does apply, most people don't understand what's involved. And if you're doing a pre-proposal or a pre-bid conference and you have a living wage clause, it's very possible that you're going to get a question from a vendor to ask you to explain it. And from what I understand, most people do is say, go contact the Department of Labor Licensing and Regulation. I don't know anything about it. And maybe you ought to know at least a little bit about it, so you might be able to answer some questions. But the ultimate authority is Labor Licensing and Regulation, because they are responsible for the applicability of the living wage. So just to give you this little bit of information, probably there are two designated tiers. There's a Tier 1 and a Tier 2. Tier 1 is 6 jurisdictions: Baltimore City, Baltimore County, Anne Arundel County, Howard County, Montgomery County, and PG County. Is that what that says up there? Yes, I believe it is. And Tier 2 is the other 18 jurisdictions in the state. So first issue is, where will a service be delivered, be performed? And that can be one of two things. Either where you're located, if you're a facility, let's say you are the Potomac Center or the Western Maryland Center. You're in Hagerstown. Hagerstown is in Washington County. Washington County is not one of the 6 counties in Tier 1, so if you have a service provided on site at Western Maryland Center or Potomac Center, the service is being provided in a Tier 2 location, so you will have a Tier 2 procurement. If a service is being provided to the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, and Health and Mental Hygiene is going to, by extension, provide this to the citizens of the state of Maryland. So you can look at it one of 2 ways. Health and Mental Hygiene is headquartered in Baltimore City, one of the 6 jurisdictions in Tier 1, Tier 1 activity. Or part of it is, where is the vendor going to deliver the service? So maybe it's for the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, but the vendor who delivers the service and might do it by simply sending a report by email or something, might be located in Hagerstown or Salisbury. So allegedly, not allegedly, it is where the vendor will deliver the service. If they have to do it on site, there's no question of where on site is. It's where you are. If they have to provide it, and they can provide it from wherever they are located, if they're located in a Tier 2 location, the living wage they have to pay is a Tier 2 living wage. And if it is not so specific as to where they're located, then you get to designate. And in particular, if the vendor is located out of state, in the solicitation it has to say what tier they must build into their price. And if it's out of state, almost inevitably it's going to be a Tier 1, because most of the citizens of Maryland live in those 6 jurisdictions. Most of the agencies are in those 6 jurisdictions. So it's almost like, if in doubt, say it's Tier 1. And what that means is there are 2 different living wages, one for Tier 1, one for Tier 2. And as of 9/27/10, 4 days ago, the living wage, because this changes every year, and the Department of Labor and Industry, the Division of Labor Industry, or Bureau of Labor and Industry it is, of the Department of Labor Licensing and Regulation, annually reviews all the economic circumstances and sets the living wage for the next year. And this thing went into effect in 97, and in 98, 99, 2000, no, not 97, 2007. In 2008, 2009, now in 2010, each year it has changed. The first year it went up by like a quarter or so an hour. Last year it went up by 2 cents, and this year it went up for like 1 cent or 2 cents again. So the living wage rate for a Tier 1 location is $22.28 an hour. And the living wage rate for a Tier 2 location is $9.23 an hour. And what that means is a vendor who is performing a service, and we might go into some of the details, has to agree they're going to pay eligible workers. And eligible workers is another level of complication. These wage rates, depending upon whether it's a Tier 1 or a Tier 2 procurement. And so they have to make sure their price is predicated upon paying these rates. And as the rates change over the course of the contract, they still must pay whatever the living wage rate is in effect for a particular contract year, and they cannot charge you more money to do it. Yes?
Living wage the same thing as minimum wage?
No.
No?
Living wage and minimum wage are not the same. Minimum wage right now is $7.15, $7.30, $7.50, something like that. Does anyone know the minimum wage right now? It is significantly below the living wage. The living wage, what the purpose of the living wage is, supposedly if somebody works at a full-time job and makes the living wage, they can live. They're not in poverty, and maybe it's simply what's going to guarantee they're above the poverty line. I'm not sure exactly, but you can make the minimum wage, and anyone will say, nope, if that's your only income for 40 hours a week, you can't make it. If you're supporting a family, that type of thing. If you're a kid who's in high school and college and get the minimum wage, fine. But if you're trying to make a living with a family, wife and kids, that kind of thing, and make the minimum wage, no, you can't do it. Yes.
How do they justify this when they have state employees that make less money than this?
How do they justify that? Do we still have any state employees that make less than this?
Oh, yeah, there's still pay scales that say that. Less
Well,
money than that.
I can tell you one way they justify it.
It's $20,400.
Doesn't apply to nonprofit organizations. We're not a nonprofit, we are a nonprofit organization. It doesn't apply to the government.
I still don't agree with it.
Believe me,
They're going to say that that's the minimum wage, that a living wage, that it should.
I remember, because I had to be involved in this in 2007, helping to implement, not to establish, but helping to implement. And I remember there was dialogue going back and forth that pointed out that very thing. What does that mean? We're going to have to raise the minimum pay to all state employees to be at least this? Answer, no. So, no, it doesn't apply.
Discrimination suit against the state for this?
No, because the law says this applies to state contracts for services. It doesn't apply to state employment. So the law is either unconstitutional, or if it's not unconstitutional, it's legal.
It's got to be breaking somebody's law. Federal law or something.
Nope. It's been on the books now for 4 years. In the planning stage, you must determine if you are procuring a service. If you are procuring a service by anything other than small procurement, you are to include the living wage clause, the living wage information, the living wage affidavit. Because there's 3 different components. There's about a third of a page clause that's supposed to put vendors on notice that the living wage applies. Then there's typically an attachment that's 2 pages, I think, that gives them more information about what the living wage means, what the implications are. And then there is a 2-page affidavit that they must sign and return to you. And what that affidavit says is twofold. Number one, they agree to abide by the living wage provision. And number 2, whether they do or do not have employees that would be eligible to be paid the living wage. Because this is going to sound strange, but you can have a contract where the living wage applies, but it can just mean that there are no employees of the vendor that are entitled to be paid the living wage. And the reason for that is, and again, I don't know if they're on the slides, but I'll just rattle it off. To be eligible as an employee, they have to work under the contract more than 13 weeks, or at least 13 weeks. They have to, in any week, work at least 50% of their time under this contract, and they have to be at least 17 at the time of their employment under this contract, and turn 18 while still employed under the contract. And if you go to things like call centers, where someone's answering the phone, almost the immediate answer is, well, we have 150 people that answer phones, that they get calls from all over the country for all kind of purposes, and no employee is going to spend more than half of their work time in any work week answering a call from Maryland callers only. Doesn't apply to anybody under that circumstance. But if you have a call center that is dedicated to Maryland operations, then what they're doing is working to answer Maryland calls. Then as long as the contract is at least 13 weeks, everybody under that contract will be entitled to be paid the living wage. So there's some complications. And again, one of the exemptions is nonprofit organizations. This doesn't apply to them. So if you do a procurement and one vendor responds and says, I'm a nonprofit, another one responds and they're a profit-making entity, the one is exempt from paying the living wage and the other isn't. If one vendor submits and says, I'm going to do the work in Allegheny County, another one submits and says, I'm going to do it in Baltimore City, the one in Baltimore City must pay their people $12.28, the one in Allegheny County $9.23. Does the Allegheny County vendor have an advantage over the Baltimore City vendor? Yes. But that's the way it is. And one thing I will say, and we mentioned this I think in the Procure class, you must get the signed affidavit from a vendor if you have the living wage clause in effect. And it must be signed, and it must be signed properly, and if a vendor doesn't give it to you, and ultimately they don't give it to you, you cannot contract with them, and if they give it to you and it's wrong, you have to go back and get them to correct it. They have to agree to do what the law requires. Anybody have any questions on living wage? I already told you more than you already wanted to know, right? Okay. DHR hiring agreement. The hiring agreement, it provides that the contractor and the Department of Human Resources, and you might, first thing you think of is, I'm either with the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene or Department of the Environment. I'm not DHR, I don't have to pay attention to this, and that's not the right answer. Because this is supposed to potentially go in any state contract that involves the contractor hiring employees to perform that contract. And this is a mechanism that the state started back in '98. That's when this law first went into effect. That basically is trying to use a lot of different approaches to get people off welfare rolls. And one of the approaches is that they, the recommendation that in all applicable contracts that this clause be included, and including this in a procurement contract means that the vendor who wins that contract is agreeing that they will, before they hire any new people to perform the contract, will contact the Department of Human Resources at least 72 hours in advance of any hiring that they do, will tell them the type of person they intend to hire, what qualifications they need, and they must give Department of Human Resources at least 72 hours, 72 working hours, 3 working days, to respond with qualified applicants for that job. And if Human Resources responds and says, yes, I have 2 people that at least from our standpoint seem to meet the qualifications you're talking about, the vendor has to then at least interview those 2 people and give them the same consideration to be hired as they would anybody else. And if they meet their requirements, they are supposed to more than consider them, they are supposed to hire them. So this is a mechanism using, again, socioeconomic efforts of the state. Obviously, if you're doing a contract for the health department to do something, implicit with a deliverable is not hiring people off DHR welfare rolls, but it does something beneficial for the state overall. So the state says, you're going to consider this in all appropriate circumstances. Yes?
What if the contract itself will not be hiring, but they're using an MBE for staffing? Is the MBE required?
The question is, does this apply, and not just to MBEs, but any subcontractors? Does it apply just to the prime contractor or subcontractors under a prime contractor? And the answer is yes, it applies. That the vendor is agreeing, and by signing this, then they must in turn pass on that requirement to any subcontractor they're going to be using. That the subcontractor cannot hire without passing on to DHR what they intend to hire somebody, what the qualifications are, etc. And this is one of 3 different laws that are on the books to try to implement this hiring. The second one is that you as a state agency are required to hire people off welfare rolls if they are eligible, and local governments are required also. There's 3 laws, 3 different laws passed in 3 different points in time that all get to the same purpose. And last year, the law was changed again, so there's no longer just people that are on welfare. It is current welfare recipients, it is former welfare recipients, it is children in foster care, and they can be in foster care up to age 21, and it is non-custodial parents who have child support administered by the Department of Human Resources. And especially when you get to the non-custodial parents, that can be people with all kinds of skills, all types of abilities, and so the law has continually been evolved since '98 to make more and more people eligible for hiring under the confines of the hiring agreement. And so what all that means is when you are planning your solicitation, along with all the other decisions you're making, should you include the DHR hiring agreement clause in your solicitation? And if you include that, that means that vendor to win must agree to do that. And there's an attachment if you have the clause in your solicitation. And that attachment is the actual 7-page agreement between the vendor and DHR. So that if this clause is in there, when the vendor wins it, they are notified by the attachment that they have, I think, 10 days after the award to sign the contract, to contact DHR, to give them some type of an overview of their expected hiring activities, and then they are to sign the contract and send it back to DHR, not to you, but to DHR. DHR co-signs it, and then it is a contract between DHR and the contractor. But the kicker is, if the vendor does not abide by that contract, the enforcement is going to be by you through your procurement contract. So DHR at some point in time can come back to you and say, this vendor, I know they're hiring people, they've never come to us and said they have anybody that they want us to provide to them, and we know they're doing it, so they're violating the contract. You, procurement officer, go get them. Make them abide by this provision. Your decision in planning is, do you include it? And it's almost like it's kind of one of these default decisions. It's almost like, unless you have a reason not to, you basically should. It's not an absolute, but, and I don't know whether there's a policy for DHMH, and I certainly don't know if there's a policy for environment, but is there a policy one way or the other?
I don't recall us having a specific policy on it, but I will say that you have to think about what it is that you're soliciting. A guard contract, which DGS normally does, if it has that in it, the contract also should have something in it that says that the employee must meet certain requirements, no criminal history, and so forth. Because otherwise, if you don't have that, you're liable to get someone who would not make a good guard. And we had that instance happen with us at Rosewood. So I don't think I don't remember a policy.
I think we have it in the enrollment program.
We do have it in there?
Yeah, and I don't know whether anyone's ever been hired.
Well, that's
Fine.
another question.
And that's more of an issue between the vendor and DHR.
I mean, they
So-
have to meet requirements, and we deal with sensitive information all the time. So it goes to a different level of employee.
If in your specifications you will put things such as cannot have a criminal record, then that is something that's passed on to a requirement under the hiring agreement. Even if you don't, though, the vendor, you can have nothing whatsoever specified in your contract as to any specific attributes of an employee of the contractor. But the contractor still has the right to say what they require as qualifications. And they can say it, even if you didn't say it in your contract, they can say, we don't want to hire anybody with a criminal record. And if that's part of the requirement, then they provide that to DHR, and DHR supposedly is going to provide someone that meets that requirement. I know we had a presentation on this just in September 18th. We had the senior procurement advisory meeting back about 2 weeks ago, and we had the presentation on the hiring agreement, and we had someone there who administered the program who said that, frankly, one of their biggest problems is that a number of the people that they have that they're trying to get jobs for are people that do have criminal records. And they said this has been a huge impediment to getting people hired, and you can see both sides of the argument. I mean, sometimes the fact you have a criminal record doesn't mean you can't do certain types of jobs, and other times, yeah, it does mean you can't do them. So if it's a reasonable requirement of either you in your solicitation or the vendor when they're hiring people, then that's just what they pass on to DHR, and the DHR people have to meet that. If they don't, then the very fact they notified DHR of the opportunity means they've satisfied the contract. So there's nothing that says they have to hire a given number of people. It says they must give DHR advance notice of the opportunity so DHR can refer people if they think they're qualified. If they don't refer anybody within 3 working days, the vendor has met their requirement to provide notice. If they refer somebody and the vendor, not unreasonably, doesn't hire them, has a good reason to not hire them, the vendor has met the requirement to at least have interviewed them and given them consideration. So to a degree, it's not much of a downside to including it in your solicitations because it's between the vendor and DHR, and the only thing the vendor ostensibly is out is 3 working days of time. But the other side of it is the vendor gets tax credits if they hire people. The people that they hire under this provision can get transportation credits, can get paid for transportation. They can get maintained on medical assistance for up to a year. So there's a whole lot of reasons why supposedly this is a good thing for employers. So, yes?
My question is, if that clause is in your contract, any correspondence between the vendor and DHR, is that something that would need to be in the procurement file?
The question is, if you include this in your contract, in your solicitation, the hiring agreement, the copy of the blank contract between DHR and the vendor, should that contract, when it's executed, be part of your file? And I would like to think yes, that you would have to communicate to DHR and the vendor to give you a copy. And so you will have that in your file, but hopefully that's the last you have to do with it. If there's questions during the solicitation phase, during the pre-bid, before the bid is due, etc., to the extent you can answer it, you answer it. But the other thing DHR asks you to do is, if you have included this clause in your solicitation, let them know when you're having a pre-bid or pre-proposal conference, and if they can, they will attend to help explain what this means to vendors. So they will be supposedly the primary one implementing this, hopefully with not much with you having to do with it. Hopefully. Yes?
Can you give me an example of when you would not use it?
When you would not use it. Okay, well, first of all, this is supposed to result in full-time employment. So, for instance, if you're doing a contract for temporary help, then the logical thing is, since temporary help is not full-time employment, you wouldn't include it. If you're doing, and what I would have said before last year, before they extended it to the non-custodial parents, when it was aimed at entry-level employment, I would have said if you're doing something for a high-technology project, you wouldn't do it. But now, it's almost like I don't know if I can think of a good exclusion that I would say, nope, shouldn't even consider it.
You're hiring somebody that
Yeah.
to include it.
And since there is such a minimal impact, particularly on you and to a large degree on the vendor, it's almost like, why not? So, yes?
Even with the temporary help, you have to do it now. We have 2 different places that we get temporary help from, and both of them have to go to DHR first.
See, that's the irony. I even pointed that out to them before this presentation 2 weeks ago, that on the one hand, the contract says full-time, but on the other hand, the packet that they have to go to vendors said part-time. And I said, you have a discrepancy between the requirement for full-time employment and a requirement for part-time to be sent to you. And they didn't reconcile that.
I think they made the determination that if it's a 40-hour position, it's considered full-time, even though it's still
If
a permanent position.
even for a couple weeks you'll work 40 hours, then they may construe that as full-time.
Correct.
But there's still a little uncertainty about that. So if in doubt, just put it in. If you have any questions, call DHR. If you have any questions, call Gary. He's an expert on this. He was at the meeting 2 weeks ago. He got the packet. He knows everything there is to know.
And that's not tied into any dollar level contract?
Nope. Hiring agreement's a hiring agreement. So if they hire 1 person, 5 people, 10 people, whatever.
Make it easy on yourself, go through your personnel officer, let them handle it.
Well, that's for hiring state employees.
Well, for hiring your tenants, you can pull it off.
Well, if they hire them as actual employees. Yes. But if you are doing a procurement contract, you need to consider whether this is in your contract. And I guess what I can say now, thinking a little more, answer your question, is it something that likely will involve at least the potential for hiring by a vendor? If you're going out and doing a commodity procurement, you're buying 100 reams of paper. No one's going to hire someone to give you 100 reams of paper. You wouldn't consider this. But if you're doing something for a food service contract, if you're doing something for broker enrollment, where you're going to have, in particular, if there is a fair amount of turnover, that's a good application of this contract, because that means even if they have someone currently with turnover, the next time they go to hire, they can make sure they prefer this to DHR. And even though this has been in existence since 1998, I will say probably the most the DHR has ever hired in a year through this is 40-some people. So it's not as if a whole thousands or even hundreds of people are getting hired by this program. And that's why they've kept expanding it year after year to try to have more impact. And part of the reason for that is it isn't going in enough contracts to begin with. So you are part of the answer for helping to get people jobs by putting this in your contracts.
So vendors have to use this first for hiring?
If you have that clause in your solicitation, they are agreeing that before they go out and hire anybody, they will go to DHR. And the only exception to that is if they have, for instance, labor agreements that says that they have to hire through like the union hall or something like that. This will not replace any existing labor agreement. So even that provision, it means, okay, if you have a labor agreement, fine. You don't go to DHR. But if other than that, you do go to DHR. So something for you to consider in the planning stage as to whether you want to do this. Non-visual access. This is something we had a whole lot of issues when it first went into effect in 97 or 98 and have no issues with it anymore, most particularly since I'm not responsible for information technology anymore since July 1, 2008, which I jump up and down and say yay about. But if there's a procurement for information technology, hardware, software, or services, it is supposed to include the clause that says there must be equal access to people that are visually impaired versus people that are not visually impaired, with a couple exceptions. So your decision at the procurement, at the planning stage is this is a mandatory clause except unless the procurement officer determines that such access is not available. So this is required unless you as the procurement officer make a determination that you can't get what you want that is non-visually accessible. Or if it is accessible, but it's more than a 5% differential in cost between buying this service or activity with non-visual access versus without non-visual access. In those two circumstances, you as the procurement officer would not include that clause in a procurement for information technology, hardware, software, or services. If you do not make one of those two determinations to exclude the clause, then you are required to include the clause in your solicitations. So you got all that? Include, exclude, this, that, okay. Just want to make sure you're still awake. In the planning stage for the purchase of information technology, hardware, or software, the procurement officer must determine whether to include the non-visual access clause. Most of agency validation efforts will then come in the procure stage. Do you include it? Do you not include it? And the default is you do unless you make a determination it's appropriate to not include it. Non-discrimination. And this is not discretionary. You will include non-discrimination clauses. There's a regular non-discrimination about employment, and there's non-discrimination against what they call commercial non-discrimination. So there's at least two clauses that are required for you to include in your solicitation that, again, do not directly impact the delivery of services, but are going after socioeconomic considerations. So just make sure you have those two. And All right, that's the requirement. Prompt payment of subcontractors. Virtually any contract has the possibility of having subcontractors work under the contract. So that means that virtually any contract is supposed to include a clause saying that the vendor must agree that they will promptly pay its subcontractors when they've gotten a payment from the state. And there's a whole provision in this that says that if they don't pay their subcontractors promptly, that you can go in and you can order them to make payment, or you can withhold payment from the payment due to them, and you can pay directly the subcontractor that they didn't pay. And this only applies if there's a non-disputed situation between the prime and the subcontractor. And supposedly if there's a legitimate dispute between the prime and the sub, and that's why the prime didn't pay, this doesn't apply. Bottom line is, in virtually any procurement you're doing, unless it's one that's just, again, buying commodities or something like that, you're going to include the prompt payment clause. And the clause itself is something like 1.5 pages or 2 pages. That's what you do. You include it in your solicitation. Yes?
Can we include that in MOU?
In an MOU?
Subcontractor?
No, no. Because these are requirements of procurement contracts. And an MOU is not a procurement contract.
Well, I have MOUs that have problems with subcontractors that don't get paid.
These are requirements for procurement contracts.
Okay.
Now, can you put it in there, and can you require a government to do it? Because an MOU can only be with a government entity. I don't know why you'd want to do that.
Try to get the contractors paid.
From your standpoint, you shouldn't even necessarily know whether the government's going to use somebody else to do the activity. I would not do this in any way, shape, or form in an MOU. Wouldn't even think about it. The thing about an MOU is the less the better in terms of external material. What you want the government to do, yes. Put your deliverables in there. Anything else, the only thing that you would keep in is anything required by law, and there are a couple clauses that are required by law for most MOUs. MBE applies to most MOUs. Non-discrimination, not this prompt payment, but non-discrimination applies to most MOUs. So there's just a couple things that, even though you're doing it with the government, you're going to include that in your MOU. Yeah. Okay. Moving on. Encouragement for intergovernmental purchasing cooperation, one of my favorites. 25 minutes before a break. Okay. Primary procurement units. There are 10 primary procurement units, and neither DHMH nor Environment is a primary procurement unit. But the Department of Budget and Management, the Department of General Services, the Department of Information Technology, Department of Transportation, Department of Public Safety, University System of Maryland, Morgan, St. Mary's College, and the Port Commission, I think, are primary procurement units, if that's 10. They specifically have the right in law to both use procurements done by other governments and to extend the procurements they are doing themselves to other governments. And that's something that there is more and more of a trend to do this. I mean, when you're in the private sector, when you're businesses don't try usually to cooperate with each other, because usually they compete with each other. So largely you don't have vendors that are trying to do teaming arrangements unless they are of the vertical integration type of activity, where I don't do something, so I'm going to go to somebody else to partner with me to provide something. Governments, you all have, we don't compete with each other. Baltimore County doesn't compete to deliver services to the clients of Howard County. And Baltimore City doesn't compete to deliver services to the citizens of Anne Arundel County. So we're not in competition. So therefore, we can, since we're each governments and we each do good things for citizens collectively, we try to work together as much as possible, and we try to get good value. We try to achieve economies of scale. And so there have been, the first law on intergovernmental cooperation was passed around 98, 99. A lot of things happened in that same time frame. And about a year and a half ago, the law was updated to almost mandate that both Maryland state government and Maryland local governments will do, as a matter of default, will extend their contracts to each other. What that means is when you write your solicitation, you will say not only this is to be provided to the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene or the Department of the Environment, but to any other government within the state of Maryland, local government, and nonprofit organizations. So currently you are supposed to think about extending this to Maryland, other Maryland governments, local governments, etc., government entities, community colleges, anything that is an instrumentality of a local government, and nonprofit organizations. And you can do it much more globally than that. You can extend it to any government. Now, the kicker is that that right is for primary procurement units, which, again, you aren't. So there's still a little bit of debate as to whether you even have the authority in your procurements to extend it to other governments or to nonprofits. And I'm still waiting for the lawyers to give me an interpretation as to whether you can do that, aside from the 10 entities that are primary procurement units. And even though you cannot use, you as Health Department of the Environment cannot use a contract of another government directly, DBM as a primary procurement unit, the interpretation is we can authorize you to do that. And so the Health Department has taken contracts for WIC rebates, contract to buy drugs, medicines, etc., contracts for rebates on infant formula, cereal, and juice. There's something you did with the Virgin Islands, WIC did with the Virgin Islands. I mean, there's a number of things DHMH has done. I don't remember if we've ever done any intergovernmental for environment, but supposedly we can let you do these type of things, and whenever appropriate, we do let you do them. So anyway, what I can say is the procurements that we are doing at DBM, almost every one of them now is being extended to, at the very least, Maryland local governments and Maryland nonprofit organizations, and some of them are being extended to any government in the country. We just awarded a contract for online job posting. So if any of you have to do, you have positions that you have authorization to fill, and you want to go and do some internet posting of those jobs, we now have a contract that went into effect today, October 1st, that you can use Monster, you can use Maryland Job Network to do these online job postings, and we extended this to Maryland local governments, etc., and we extended it to adjacent states to Maryland, including Washington, D.C. And we're doing something right now for fleet management that we're extending to any government in the country. So it's something that we try to get the economies of scale. We try to help each other. And from your standpoint, you mostly hope to be on the receiving end, that through intergovernmental you don't have to do a procurement, because it's still unknown whether you can actually do this and extend it to other governments. Any questions on that?
I just want to comment. The last thing that Joel said was really, really important. If you can find another governmental entity that has your service that you're looking for, and if that contract allows it to be used, and if DBM allows it to be used, it's going to save you lots of time and potentially lots of aggravation.
And hopefully money.
And hopefully money. So call around to some neighboring states, not even neighboring states. Call around.
Yeah, almost the first thing you do anymore is a web search to see if you can put in some keywords and see if a contract pops up for another government. And then the other thing, and I think I mentioned this yesterday, you have to look for what I call the magic clause that extends the use to other governments. And if that's in there, then you come to DBM if it's a service. and hopefully I didn't cover the mic. But the primary procurement units can only authorize this within the scope of their authority. So if you want to buy a commodity through intergovernmental cooperative purchasing, you have to go to DGS. If you want information technology, you have to go to DOIT, Department of Information Technology. So we can authorize services, we can't authorize anything beyond our control authority. But it is a big time saver, yes.
So are you saying if Virginia had a enrollment broker contract,
Yeah?
and they had this clause in their contract,
Yeah?
we could go and say the company is, I don't know, Lockheed Martin.
Okay.
So we could piggyback on their contract?
Did you hear her question? All right, she is involved with the enrollment broker contract. That's getting people on medical assistant roles into a managed care organization.
All right.
And that was first bid in 1996 because it was the last thing I did before I went to budget and management. That was my last procurement. And
Hopefully this will be.
you're going to go, and another procurement's coming up, and her question is, since other states do broker enrollment contracts, can she, for instance, go and try to get the Virginia contract and look and see if the magic language is in the Virginia contract, and if it is, can she seek to piggyback on the Virginia contract instead of doing her own procurement? And the answer is yes, if the Virginia contract has enough similarity that you can get what you want within the context of that contract. So it depends on how specific versus how generic it is. If it, and frankly, one of the things I was doing with Gary at lunchtime is we were looking at a contract for another activity to see if a different unit of DHMH could use that contract for something they wanted. And they came down, they showed me the contract, they told me what they wanted, and I said, looks fine to me.
Yeah, you know, I was thinking about that too, because we have to do this automated verification system for the age blind and disabled population. And right now, there's only two companies that do it, Acuity and HRM or HLM or whoever. Who is it? HRM. And we already have them as our TPO contractors. So maybe we don't have to do it. Maybe we can just.
You have them under another contract? All right, well, that's not the, there would have to be, what is this thing you said? Eligibility, or what was it?
Asset verification system.
Asset verification.
Yeah, I know
Okay.
it's not the same thing as this, but
If there's another state that has asset verification, and even if they're only dealing with one of those two vendors, let me
only
give you,
federal government.
let me give you an example. Department of Human Resources is one of, through Department of Human Resources, Maryland is one of 19 states participating in a procurement done by the state of Michigan for fiscal intermediary services. And there's only supposedly 2 vendors in the country that do this. They got one of those 2. We're using the vendor that resulted from the Michigan procurement.
No, but didn't earlier you say that if the agency that you work for already has a contract with a company, and now you want a different service?
If a government has a contract.
Yeah, we are the government. DHMH has a contract with this company.
But if you have a contract for one activity,
Right.
you can't use that contract for a specific activity to modify it to include an entirely different activity. That you can't do. But you can go to another government that has a contract for that second activity, and you can seek to use that contractor instead of doing your own procurement.
Okay, so you couldn't do a modification to an existing contract to allow for a different activity?
The modification of an existing contract, the first test is it within the scope of that contract? And if it's something completely different, the answer that will come back, hopefully from you, if not from you by your attorney, and if not from them by the control agency, will be no, it is not within the scope. As soon as there's a determination it is not within the scope, you can't do it. And if you had 2 separate contracts before, the logic is that each one has a separate scope, and you can't have a crossing of the 2. That would be what I would say offhand.
But if it's a federal government that has the same contract as what we're looking at doing, we can
can piggyback off theirs.
The provision about other governments, and this is a little bit tricky, the federal government, for the most part, does not allow their contracts to be used by states and other localities. There's only two types of contracts that they extend to states, etc. So Maryland law allows us to contract with the contractor regardless of whether the federal government authorizes that contract to provide it to states and local governments. So in answer to your question, if there is a vendor that has a federal contract to do what you want, again, with the approval of the primary procurement unit, yes, you can contract with that entity. But it has to be same terms and conditions, same price. And I will tell you, to this point, that has been on the books since I think '98, and to this point, I can only remember one instance in now 12 years when we at DBM have awarded a contract via intergovernmental cooperative purchasing to a vendor who has a federal contract because of that requirement that it has to be the same terms and conditions and same price. But it's worth looking at. And believe me, Gary will help you anything that can avoid a procurement. We're not trying to get more work. We all try to get away with as little as we can because there's enough out there that we're still going to have enough to do. A hand up or?
Before we leave 238, wasn't there a slide that identified the primary procurement units, or did you just tell me?
There was a slide in overview. I don't know if there's a slide in this. No, I don't think there's a slide in this. In overview, though, there is. It identifies the 10. And the strange thing is, if you go to Comar Title 21, it's not in there. You have to go to the State Finance and Procurement article to find out who the primary procurement units are. So, but for your purposes, DHMH isn't one. And most of them can only do it for their own purposes. For instance, transportation can only do it for transportation contracts that they do. Public safety can only do it for prison construction, which they do. Morgan can only do it for Morgan. University can only do it for the university. Port Commission for port activities. St. Mary's College for St. Mary's College. So the only ones you could use would be DGS, DBM, do it. And from your standpoint, that covers. Oh, and the other one is the Treasurer's Office. So those four are the ones that are general control agencies that you could potentially go to them for what you want. Treasurer, do it, DBM, DGS. All right, moving on. 10 minutes till break time, right? Come on, break time. See, I give you a little bit and you get greedy. Here's characteristics that you may want to look at for intergovernmental cooperative purchasing. Here's the suggested clause, and I think I have updated this to include nonprofit organizations. So Maryland County, municipal, and other non-state of Maryland governments or agencies within Maryland and nonprofit organizations may purchase from the contractor goods or services covered by this contract at the same prices chargeable to the state. All such purchases by non-state of Maryland governments or agencies or nonprofit organizations, 1, shall constitute contracts between the contractor and that government, agency, or organization. Key to this is they get to use your contract, but you have no obligations and no baggage because they do, other than the fact that usually we can benefit by their additional purchases. So this is something that hopefully is all benefit and no extra effort involved. 2, shall not constitute purchases by the state or state agencies against the contract. 3, shall not be binding or enforceable against the state. And 4, may be subject to other terms and conditions agreed to by the contractor and the purchaser. The contractor bears the risk of determining whether or not a government agency or organization with which the contractor is dealing is a Maryland state agency. So that is the typical suggested clause that we use that you may or may not be able to use, and that could be modified to not make it simply Maryland local governments, but any government. So there's like 2 variations. This is the typical that extends it within the state. And we're not going to do that now. So I guess this is a good time to break.